welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, chapters 18 through 20, the part of the book where Victor Frankenstein finally begins to fulfill the monster's request. But before we get into this section, I'd like to thank all my patrons on Patreon. I really appreciate you, and thank you so much for supporting me. If you've not checked out my Patreon page yet, you ought to go over there because I have a lot of great resources to help you in your study of works of literature, including guided study questions for Frankenstein and other works, as well as a lot of other fun things that I throw up over there. At the end of chapter 17, Victor had just agreed to create a second monster, a companion for his creature. And he definitely had very mixed feelings about that, but ultimately he felt like he had to do it. He owed a duty to the creature, he had neglected the creature, and also the creature had threatened him. However, as chapter 18 begins, Victor's definitely not in the same frame of mind he was in when he created the first creature. He is stalling, procrastinating, and moping a lot. Day after day, week after week passed away on my return to Geneva, and I could not collect the courage to recommence my work. I feared the vengeance of the disappointed fiend, yet I was unable to overcome my repugnance to the task which was enjoined me. He also recognizes that not only is he creating a second creature, which was very hard the first time, but he's also creating a slightly different kind of creature. Instead of creating the male monster, he's creating a female version, so that the creature can have not only that companionship, but potentially the love. And Victor realizes that creating a different kind of monster, creating a female monster with all the differences between the sexes, is going to require a bit more study on his part. He's going to have to figure out how to do that. And so he's going to have to meet with some experts and learn a few more things before he can get around to creating this creature. Meanwhile, he's been really moping around, but he is getting healthier and he is getting stronger after his recent depression and ordeals. And so eventually his father confronts him. And his father notices how standoffish Victor has been for some time since he's returned from college. And of course, there was a lot of grief, there was a lot of hard things. They lost his little brother, they lost Justine, lots of complicated things involved there. So they were trying to give him time, but he's not come around to being close to the family again. And this concerns Victor's father. And Victor's father has come to a conclusion in his mind that maybe part of the problem is not just all the events of the past and the griefs of the past, but specifically that Victor doesn't want to marry Elizabeth, and everyone is expecting him to. So the family is, assumed the two will get married someday since basically the beginning of the book. It was Victor's mother's dying wish after all. But Victor's dad suddenly pauses and says, you know what, maybe Victor is worried because all of us are putting all this pressure on him to marry Elizabeth, all these assumptions that he's going to marry Elizabeth, and maybe he just doesn't want to. Maybe part of his distance, maybe part of his moodiness comes from the fact that he really just doesn't want to, or maybe he's met someone else, some other problem like that. When he confronts Victor with this, Victor immediately explains it all away and says, no, that's, I've always wanted to marry Elizabeth, I plan on marrying Elizabeth, it's definitely my goal, I just have a lot on my mind. And so Alphonse Frankenstein says, well, why don't we just hurry up and have the wedding? After all, I'm not getting any younger. But the thought of getting married right now, while he's got this looming doom over him, is pretty frightening to Victor. The monster's threat is real, and if Victor just runs off and gets married and leaves the monster lonely and alone, it's going to cause problems. For sure. The monster's going to be angry. And so this is the push, I guess, that Victor needs to go out there and finally fulfill his promise. He decides he's going to need to go to England on a trip, not only to get away from his family so that he can do this dark task, but also because he still has some research left to do in order to figure out how to create this second creature. His father sees this as a good sign and thinks, okay, well, he'll go have this nice trip, and then he'll come home, and then we'll have the wedding as soon as they get back. Elizabeth also, seeing how moody and isolated Victor is, works out for Henry to go with him without telling Victor. Victor needs someone in his life, and Elizabeth can clearly see that. It's been a recurring theme throughout the whole book. Victor goes to bad places when he's alone. And Victor's concerned because, well, he has this horrible task to do, and so that's more difficult with a companion. But at the same time, having Henry with him will boost his spirits on the way, and will also, potentially keep the monster from leering over his shoulder the whole time. If Henry is in company, then the monster probably won't come up and, bother him and threaten him and encourage him strongly. So this might work out well as long as Victor can have that isolated time at the end of the trip to finish his task. And Victor, of course, is tormented by all of his thoughts about the creature. Is his family going to be safe while he's on this journey? And he decides that, yes, probably the best thing for him to do would be to go away from his family, because after all, the creature will probably follow him, and so his family will be safe back home, as long as it looks like Victor is moving towards his task. And so Victor and Henry Clerval start on their journey, and Victor is all moody and brooding, but Henry is enjoying the trip, and he is trying to liven things up, and he's talking his lofty sentiments to Victor. And the rest of chapter 18 really focuses on Henry. Alas, how great was the contrast between us. He was alive to every new scene, joyful when he saw the beauties of the setting sun, and more happy when he beheld it rise and recommence a new day. He pointed out to me the shifting colors of the landscape and the appearances of the sky. "This is what it is to live," he cried. "Now I enjoy existence. But you, my dear Frankenstein, wherefore are you desponding and sorrowful?" In truth, I was occupied by gloomy thoughts, and neither saw the descent of the evening star nor the golden sunrise reflected in the Rhine. And you, my friend, would be far more amused with the journey of Clerval, who observed the scenery with an eye of feeling and delight, than in listening to my reflections. I, a miserable wretch, haunted by a curse that shut up every avenue to enjoyment. Here is Victor, of course, speaking directly to Captain Walton again, and he's pointing out, again, the difference between Henry and himself. Henry is full of these lofty sentiments, this appreciation of beauty, and the appreciation of all the things that they're seeing, and Victor is so caught up in himself that he can't enjoy the world. And Victor in his story here continues to quote Henry and the great, wonderful things that Henry is saying for the next several pages, until finally he comes to this moment where he's sort of emotionally overwhelmed by his thoughts of his old friend Henry, and we get this really heavy sense of foreshadowing. "Clerval, beloved friend, even now it delights me to record your words, and to dwell on the praise of which you are so eminently deserving. He was a being formed in the very poetry of nature. His wild and enthusiastic imagination was chastened by the sensibility of his heart. His soul overflowed with ardent affections, and his friendship was of that devoted and wondrous nature that the worldly minded teach us to look for only in imagination. But even human sympathies were not sufficient to satisfy his eager mind. The scenery of external nature, which others regard only with admiration, he loved with ardor. The sounding cataract haunted him like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep gloomy wood, of their colors and their forms, were then to him an appetite, a feeling, and a love that had no need of remoter charm, by thought supplied, or any interest unborrowed from the eye. And where does he exist now? Is this gentle and lovely being lost forever? Has this mind so replete with ideas, imaginations fanciful and magnificent, which formed a world whose existence depended upon the life of its creator, has this mind perished? Does it now only exist in my memory? No, it is not thus. Your form, so divinely wrought and beaming with beauty, has decayed, but your spirit still visits and consoles your unhappy friend. So we get this really strong sense of, his admiration of Henry as like the epitome of the perfect friend, the person who is so lofty and so high in his sentiments, these great thoughts of Henry. And as he remembers them with all this affection and joy, all of a sudden it turns to this, he's lost, he's gone. There is no more Henry. Henry's mind has been snuffed out. Or has it. Maybe the spirit of Henry still follows me and still comforts me. Very strong foreshadowing that Henry is no more. And also a hint towards a key idea about the spirits of friendship that we're going to address near the end of the book. So keep that in mind. I should also note the heavy romanticism with which he portrays this perfect friend who is so in tune with nature and with his emotions and with his lofty ideals. He even quotes a nice heavy section of Tintern Abbey by Wordsworth in here. Chapter 19 continues their journey. They stop in London where they meet with several different people. And Henry is enjoying the connection with the intellects and the great thinkers of this particular area, whereas Victor is enduring the misery of thinking of his task. All of his interactions are based upon what he can get out of them in order to finish this awful job he's locked into. And so he's not able to enjoy them with as much fervor as he would have previously. From London, they decide to go on up to Scotland, where they hope to see some more natural vistas, and also, Victor thinks he will get a private place to work on his creature. For several pages, Victor describes the various sights they see. And it's interesting because each of them is connected with great thinkers or great moments in history. We see the connections to the English Revolution, where they killed Charles I. And all of these locations that have a really fascinating historical interest seem like just almost superfluous stuff. We're getting through the trip, we need to get to the part where Victor creates the monster. But I want to point out the connection here. As Victor is observing all of these things and reflecting on all of these things, we should possibly connect this back with the moment that the creature was listening to all of these stories of history and human accomplishment. And notice the opportunity for both the creature and Victor to think about and reflect upon human experience, the great noble things that humans can be, as well as the cruel and vicious things that no humans can do. Both of them reflect on these ideas, but then turn their eyes inward to their own suffering and their own misery. This is just one of the many associations and connections we see between the creature and Victor. They both have this need for friendship, although perhaps they don't approach it in the same way. They both have this great intellect. They both have these great romantic feelings. They both reflect on humanity in very similar ways. And yet somehow Victor cannot connect himself with his creature, never could. As their journey goes on, Victor is becoming more and more tense because he's concerned that he's taking too long to fulfill the creature's promise. I had now neglected my promise for some time, and I feared the effects of the demon's disappointment. He might remain in Switzerland and wreak his vengeance upon my relatives. This idea pursued me and tormented me at every moment from which I might otherwise have snatched repose and peace. I waited for my letters with feverish impatience. If they were delayed, I was miserable and overcome by 1,000 fears. When they arrived, I saw the superscription of Elizabeth or my father. I hardly dared to read and ascertain my fate. Sometimes I thought the fiend followed me and might expedite my remissness by murdering my companion. When these thoughts possessed me, I could not quit Henry for a moment, but followed him as a shadow to protect him from the fancied rage of my destroyer. I felt as if I had committed some great crime, the consciousness of which haunted me. I was guiltless, but I had indeed drawn down a horrible curse upon my head, as mortal as that of crime. Finally, Victor tells Henry that he's going to do his own little private tour of Scotland while Henry talks with some of these friends for a while. "Do you," said I, "enjoy yourself, and let this be our rendezvous. I may be absent a month or two, but do not interfere with my motions, I entreat you. Leave me to peace and solitude for a short time, and when I return, I hope it will be with a lighter heart, more congenial to your own temper." Henry isn't super enthused by Victor going off on his own, but eventually he relents and says, well, hurry up and get done and come on back to visit me. I'd rather be with you than with these people. And so Victor travels off to this tiny little island in the Orkneys, which is basically this barren place with a few miserable peasants and a couple of huts. One of these huts is run down and broken, and Victor hires it in order to complete his task. He knows that nobody on this island will care what he does. They have no interest in anything. And so it's a great private place to complete his dark deed of creating a second creature. As he finally begins the task, again, it's very difficult to push himself into completing it. Sometimes I could not prevail upon myself to enter the laboratory for several days, and at other times I toiled day and night in order to complete my work. It was indeed a filthy process in which I was engaged. During my first experiment, a kind of enthusiastic frenzy had blinded me to the horror of my employment. My mind was intentionally fixed on the consummation of my labor, and my eyes shut to the horror of my proceedings. But now I went to it in cold blood, and my heart often sickened at the work of my hands. Chapter 20 begins just as Victor basically gets to the end of the process. He's gotten the creature prepared and is ready to bring it to life. But just as he gets to this process, he begins to reflect on a couple of points he hadn't considered when he first argued with the creature. What if this female creature does not have the same sentiments as the other? What if she refuses to be companion to the other? Or what if she refuses to fulfill the conditions that the creature laid down and go and live in isolation with him? What if she decides to be her own evil and wreak havoc upon humanity? There's no way either Victor or the creature can know that. Not only that, but since she's a female, what if they produce a bunch of children, and then eventually the world is overrun with monsters, and humanity in the future curses the name of Victor Frankenstein? Just as he's reflecting upon this and getting more and more uncomfortable with what he's about to do, the creature's face appears in the window. I trembled, and my heart failed within me, when on looking up I saw by the light of the moon the demon in the casement. A ghastly grin wrinkled his lips as he gazed on me, where I sat fulfilling the task which he had allotted to me. Yes, he had followed me on my travels. He had loitered in forests, hid himself in caves, or taken refuge in wide and deserted heaths. And he now came to mark my progress and claim the fulfillment of my promise. As I looked on him, his countenance expressed the utmost extent of malice and treachery. I thought with a sensation of madness on my promise of creating another like to him, and trembling with passion, tore to pieces the thing on which I was engaged. The wretch saw me destroy the creature, on whose future existence he depended for happiness, and with a howl of devilish despair and revenge, withdrew. And so, in this moment, Victor changes his mind, reverses his decision, and destroys his second creation. Right in the face of the first creature. Clearly, this is going to have rather intense repercussions. And Victor, kind of emotionally spent, just kind of collapses and sits there, until shortly after, the creature appears again. It walks inside, shuts the door, and begins to speak. "You have destroyed the work which you began. What is it that you intend? Do you dare to break your promise?" And Victor says, "Begone! I'll never do it! Never! Never create another evil creature like you!" And then the creature says something which I really want to hone in on. "Slave, I before reasoned with you, but you have proved yourself unworthy of my condescension. Remember that I have power. You believe yourself miserable, but I can make you so wretched that the light of day will be hateful to you. You are my creator, but I am your master. Obey." And still Victor refuses, and so then the creature is going to get revenge. We get that point, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But I wanted to point out the chiasmus here. A chiasmus is a reversal, a statement that is then inverted. When the creature was first pleading with Victor, back when the two of them first met up on the glacier, he said several times, "I am your creature." And he was trying to evoke a kind of sense of duty in Victor. I am your creature, therefore you owe me the duty as my creator. And there's a power differential here, right? Here's the creature who was created by a creator. Therefore, the creator is more like a God and Adam relationship, as we noted from the Paradise Lost references throughout the book. It should be that Victor, as the creator, is a father figure, a God figure who then cares for and initiates his creation. But because he chose instead to abandon the creature had to develop itself. Initially, as creator, Victor should have the control and power in the situation. But now things are inverted. The creature now has more control over Victor. Victor has the power to create more life, and therefore give the creature companionship. But because he refuses to do so, the creature is now taking the role of the master. He calls Victor his slave. You are my creator, but I am your master. There is a reversal of role now. Again, as Victor absolutely refuses and says there's nothing in the world that will ever drive him to create another creature. The monster says, "Shall each man find a wife for his bosom, and each beast have its mate, and I be alone? I had feelings of affection, and they were requited by detestation and scorn. Man, you may hate, but beware, your hours will pass in dread and misery, and soon the bolt will fall." Clearly, the creature wants Victor to suffer, and he says, "I may have lost everything, but I still have my revenge." And notice what kind of revenge he's seeking. It's very clear he wants Victor not to die, exactly, but to curse his existence and to suffer. And primarily, he doesn't want Victor to be happy and companioned while he himself is wretched and alone. I want you to feel the same suffering I'm feeling. I want you to see what it's like to have absolutely no one who loves you. And Victor again just swears he'll never bow to the monster's wishes. And so then the monster leaves him with a threat and a promise. He says, "It is well I go, but remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night." And that is a line which is going to be clearly the key threat to Victor. And Victor is going to carry that warning with him into the next several chapters. Are any of us confused about what the monster is saying? It seems pretty clear that he wants Victor to be miserable and alone and have no joy, no companionship, and no happiness, just like he is. Therefore, the threat is very clearly not against Victor, but against all of his friends and family, primarily against Elizabeth. But here we see Victor is incredibly egocentric. We've noted that kind of all the way along, but Victor constantly gets sucked into his own emotions, his own feelings, and therefore he cannot see the threat to the people around him. After the creature leaves, Victor's reflecting on all of this and says, "I shuddered to think who might be the next victim sacrificed to his insatiate revenge. And then I thought again of his words, 'I will be with you on your wedding night.' That then was the period fixed for the fulfillment of my destiny. In that hour, I should die, and at once satisfy and extinguish his malice. The prospect did not move me to fear, yet when I thought about my beloved Elizabeth, of her tears and endless sorrow when she should find her lover so barbarously snatched from her, tears, the first I had shed for many months, streamed from my eyes, and I resolved not to fall before my enemy without a bitter struggle." Victor, being an idiot, thinks that the creature is coming after him on his wedding night. I mean, that wasn't even remotely confusing. I also want to note here, and we're going to come back to this idea in the next section pretty clearly, how very distant Victor has been from Elizabeth. Elizabeth has been waiting for Victor for several years now. And in that entire time, he's been very cold and distant to her. And he just sort of assumes she'll always be there for him when he's ready to settle down and get married. But first he has to get through all of his own emotional problems. He neglected her seriously while he was at college because he was so caught up in his studies. And then the creature came and he wrote back and forth to her a little bit. But then there's all the emotional trauma over the death of his brother and all those sorts of things. And he has been so emotionally distant from her. So much so that the rest of the family begin to assume maybe he doesn't actually love her. And we might ask the question ourselves as well. Does he actually love her, or is she just his prize that he ultimately gets at the end of all this? He certainly hasn't given her much love or affection in the past, 6, 7 years. Just assuming she'll be there for him because she was promised to him, everyone assumes they're going to get married. Maybe it's not him who's stuck in this relationship, but rather her. That's something to examine further in the next section. But before we get there, we have a few more loose ends to tie up. Victor receives a letter from Henry saying that he would really like to see Victor again, and he's ready to start traveling. And so Victor says, okay, well, I'll clean up here, and then I'll go back and see Henry and head home face my doom. And so he doesn't want to leave all of the like pieces of a creature around because that'll be weird if people find that. And so he gathers up all of his instruments and the body parts of his creature, and he bags them all up and throws them in a boat and rows out and dumps it all into the sea. He then, in his exhaustion, decides to just lie down in his boat and sleep for a while. And he kind of blows into the strong wind and realizes that he's beginning to take on water, and he thinks he's going to drown, and it's all going to be lost anyway, and the monster's revenge will be wreaked by nature. And he finally realizes that he actually does want to live. How mutable are our feelings, and how strange is that clinging love we have of life, even in the excess of misery. And he manages to see this town and get his boat there, and he gets on shore, and he's relieved. And he finds these people kind of staring at him strangely with suspicion in their eyes, but he's so relieved from overcoming his ordeal in the water that he doesn't really notice at first. And when he asks for help, they arrest him and bring him before a magistrate, because it seems there was a murder committed here last night. And so chapter 20 ends with Victor under arrest. I wonder who committed the murder. We'll find out, and we'll find out what happens as Victor moves towards his final confrontation with the creature in the next reading. Thanks for watching. You can click to subscribe or to go to my Patreon page where you can find lots of other resources. And I will see you next time. Bye-bye.